The red earth of Ajebandele village had not tasted rain for 7 moons. Dust devils danced between the mud brick houses like ancestral spirits warning of trouble to come. The women knew, oh how the women knew, that something was stirring in the spiritual realm. Their cowrie shells sang different songs now, and the palm wine turned bitter in their calabashes. Apostle Selman's Land Rover coughed and wheezed like an old man's last breath as it rolled into the village center. The vehicle, a symbol of the outside world, of missions and modernization, seemed out of place among the traditional compounds where families had lived for generations. Its chrome bumper caught the harsh afternoon sun, throwing light daggers across the faces of curious children who peered from behind their mother's colorful wrapper clothes. "Pastor Don come! Pastor Don come!" The cry rippled through the village like water over stones. But Selman was not just any pastor. He was an apostle, a title that carried weight in these parts, where spiritual authority was measured not in degrees from foreign seminaries but in the ability to call down fire from heaven and cast out demons with a word. His reputation had traveled faster than his vehicle, carrying on the wings of testimonies from neighboring villages where the blind had received sight and the lame had walked. The apostle stepped from his vehicle, dust coating his black suit like a second skin. He was a man of medium height with skin dark as fertile soil, his eyes holding the kind of intensity that made people believe he could see into their souls. Around his neck hung a simple wooden cross, carved from Irako wood, a concession to local tradition that had served him well in his ministry across the heartland. "Peace be unto this house," he called out in Yoruba, his voice carrying the authority of one who had wrestled with angels and lived to tell the tale. The village head, Baba Agba, emerged from the largest compound, his agbada flowing like water around his aged frame. White hair crowned his head like cotton clouds and his walking stick, carved with ancestral symbols, tapped against the earth with each measured step. Behind him trailed the council of elders, their faces maps of wisdom and worry. "Apostle Selman," Baba Agba's voice was like gravel mixed with honey, "we have called you because our daughters are no longer our daughters." The old man's words hung in the air like smoke from sacrificial fires. Around them, the normal sounds of village life, children playing, mortars pounding, chickens clucking, seemed muted as if the very air held its breath. "Tell me, Baba," Selman replied, switching to English that was peppered with indigenous expressions, "what manner of affliction has come upon them?" Before the elder could answer, a sound rose from the far end of the village, a keening, wailing cry that made the hair on every neck stand like soldiers at attention. It was the voice of a woman, but twisted, distorted, as if something else was using her throat as an instrument of torment. "You hear?" Baba Agba's eyes were wide with fear and frustration. "This is what we wake to. This is what we sleep to. Our women, 5 of them, they are no longer themselves. They speak in tongues we do not know, they eat nothing but red earth, and their eyes." He shuddered. "Their eyes are like pools of darkness with no bottom." The apostle's lodging was prepared in the compound of Mama Kemi, a trader whose late husband had been a deacon in the village's small church. Her home was modest but clean, the walls decorated with a curious mixture of Christian imagery and traditional symbols, a testament to the religious complexity that defined modern African spirituality. "Apostle," Mama Kemi served him water in a clay pot, her movements quick and nervous. "You must understand something. These women, they were not always this way. Ada was the best drummer in 3 villages. Funmi could weave patterns that made the angels weep. Nkem's voice at harvest festivals could call down blessings from the sky itself." She paused, wrapping her head tie more tightly around her hair. "But something happened 3 months ago. Something that the elders do not want to speak about." Selman set down the clay pot, his attention sharp as a hunting spear. "What happened, Mama?" "The white man came. The one with papers and promises. He said he had bought land, our sacred grove where the ancestors rest. He brought machines, big machines that dug into the earth like metal termites. The day they cut down the ancient silk cotton tree." Her voice broke. That was the day the madness began. The apostle's jaw tightened. He had seen this before, the collision between indigenous spirituality and foreign exploitation, with ordinary people caught in the spiritual crossfire. The ancestors did not surrender their dwelling places quietly, and when their rest was disturbed, the consequences rippled through the community like stones thrown into still water. "Where are these women now?" he asked. "They have been taken to the old palaver hut at the edge of the village. The one where we used to hold moon ceremonies before the church said such things were evil." Her voice carried the weight of loss, of traditions abandoned in the name of progress. As evening approached, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Selman made his way to the palaver hut. The structure was traditional, circular, with mud walls and a thatched roof that seemed to breathe with the wind. Ancient symbols were carved into the doorposts, protective markings that had stood sentinel for generations. But as he approached, the symbols seemed to writhe and move in the flickering light of the oil lamps that surrounded the hut. The very air crackled with spiritual tension, like the moments before lightning strikes. Inside, the 5 women sat in a circle, their backs straight as spears, their eyes closed but their lips moving in silent conversations with unseen entities. They were women of different ages, from young Ada, barely 20, to Mama Ngozi, who had seen 6 decades of sun and rain. But now they all wore the same expression of otherworldly communion, their faces masks of spiritual occupation. "Sisters," Selman called softly, "I have come to pray with you." 5 pairs of eyes snapped open simultaneously, and what looked back at him was not human recognition but something older, wilder, filled with the rage of the dispossessed. "Prayer?" The voice that came from Ada's throat was layered, as if multiple entities spoke through her. "Your prayers are like chaff before the wind, son of the colonizer's God. We were here before your wooden cross, before your book of foreign promises." The spiritual confrontation that followed would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations. It was not merely a battle between Christian faith and traditional spirits, but a collision of worldviews, a contest for the souls of a people caught between their ancestral heritage and the demands of a changing world. "I know who you are," Selman said, his voice steady as ancient stone. "You are the guardians of the sacred grove, the spirits who have watched over this land since time immemorial. I do not come as your enemy." The woman named Funmi laughed, but the sound was like wind through dry leaves. "You speak with honey on your tongue, but your heart serves the God who blessed the chains that bound our people, the God whose followers dug their churches into our sacred soil." "The God I serve," Selman replied, moving closer to the circle, "is not the God of the colonizers. He is the God of the oppressed, the God who heard the cries of the enslaved, the God who lifts up the downtrodden. He is the same God who spoke to our ancestors in their own language before the missionaries came with their translations." The spirits possessing the women hissed and recoiled, but something in Selman's words had struck a chord. He continued, his voice rising with the power of conviction. "You rage because your resting place has been violated. You cry out because your people have forgotten the old ways, traded their birthright for promises that crumble like clay in the rain. But these daughters of the soil are not your enemies, they are your legacy, your continuation. In possessing them, you destroy what you seek to protect." Mama Ngozi's body convulsed, and when she spoke, her voice was different, deeper, more ancient. "Our tree fell with the sound of thunder. Our spring was poisoned with the machine's oil. Where shall the ancestors dwell if not in the bodies of their children?" "The ancestors dwell in the memory," Selman said, kneeling now at the edge of their circle. "They live in the stories told by moonlight, in the wisdom passed from grandmother to granddaughter, in the strength that flows through the blood of the children. But they do not possess, they guide. They do not control, they counsel." The apostle reached into his pocket and withdrew not a Bible, but a small pouch of earth, red soil from his own village, mixed with ash from his grandfather's compound. "I too am a child of this soil," he said, letting the earth fall through his fingers. "I too carry the ancestors in my blood. The God I serve does not erase our heritage, he redeems it." What happened next would challenge every seminary textbook and every traditional practice guide. Selman did not begin with Christian prayers or scriptural quotations. Instead, he began to sing, not hymns but the praise songs of his own ancestry, the warrior chants that had strengthened his forefathers before battle. "Ogun el Agba, iron and fire, strength and power, we call upon the righteous ancestors, we honor those who came before." The possessed women's bodies began to sway, not with the violence of spiritual conflict but with the rhythm of recognition. These were songs their own grandmothers had sung, melodies that carried the DNA of their cultural identity. Village elders who had gathered outside the hut began to hum along, their voices joining the apostles in a chorus that bridged the gap between Christian faith and ancestral wisdom. Even Baba Agba, despite his earlier fears, found himself tapping his walking stick in rhythm with the ancient beat. "You see," Selman continued, still singing, "we do not abandon the ancestors when we follow the Most High God. We understand that the Creator who made the baobab tree also made the eagle that nests in its branches. The God who carved the mountains also carved the valleys. He is not foreign to our soil, he is the source of our soil." The spirit speaking through Nkem's voice began to waver. "But the sacred grove, the tree that held our covenant, cannot be replanted in the same place, Selman acknowledged, his voice heavy with shared grief. But seeds carry within them the full memory of the tree. The sacred can be re-established. The covenant can be renewed. But not through the possession of the innocent. The apostle stood and began to move around the circle of women, his movements taking on the characteristics of a traditional dance. Part worship, part warfare, part negotiation. In his hand, he held his wooden cross, but he wielded it not as a weapon but as a symbol of intersection, the place where the vertical relationship with the divine met the horizontal relationship with community. I propose a covenant, he said, his voice carrying the authority of both apostle and son of the soil. Let these daughters be released and I will work with the village to establish a new sacred space, not to replace what was lost but to honor what continues. The ancestors will have their place, the people will have their peace, and the Creator will have His glory. The possessed women's bodies began to shudder as if great winds were blowing through them. The spiritual entities that had occupied them for months were beginning to withdraw, but not in defeat, in negotiation and compromise, in the kind of spiritual diplomacy that required deep understanding of both divine and cultural law. Dawn broke over Ajebandele village like a promise fulfilled. The harmattan winds, which had been still for days, began to blow again, carrying with them the scent of approaching rain. The possessed women lay sleeping in the palaver hut, their faces peaceful for the first time in months, while the apostle maintained his vigil outside, praying in languages both learned and inherited. As the sun painted the sky in shades of hope, Ada was the first to wake. Her eyes, which had been pools of alien darkness, now held their natural warmth. She sat up slowly, confusion and recognition battling across her features. Apostle? Her voice was her own again, hoarse from months of otherworldly utterances. What has happened to us? One by one the other women awakened. Funmi, Nkem, Mama Ngozi, and finally Comfort, the youngest of them all. They looked around the hut with the bewilderment of people returning from a long journey to a place that was both familiar and strange. You have been on a spiritual journey, Selman said gently, helping Ada to sit up. But you have returned to us. The ancestors have released you and you are free. The reunion with their families was like a festival of tears and laughter. Husbands embraced wives they had thought lost forever. Children clung to mothers who had been strangers in their own homes. The village itself seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for months. But the apostle's work was not finished. He had promised the ancestral spirits a new sacred space, and such promises were not made lightly in the spiritual realm. For 3 days he worked with the village elders, the traditional priests, and even some of the younger Christians to design a memorial grove that would honor the past while embracing the future. The new space was established on a hill overlooking the village, where ancient cashew trees provided natural shelter. It contained elements that spoke to multiple spiritual traditions, a small chapel for Christian worship, a traditional shrine for ancestral veneration, and a central fire pit where both could come together in harmony. This is not syncretism, Selman explained to the gathered crowd during the dedication ceremony. This is recognition that the God of all creation speaks to all people in the language they can understand. He spoke to Moses in a burning bush, to Gideon through a fleece, to our ancestors through the voices of the wind and the wisdom of the elders. But as the weeks passed and life in the village began to return to normal, Selman discovered that the possession of the 5 women had been only the surface of a much deeper spiritual crisis. The mining company that had destroyed the sacred grove was part of a larger pattern of cultural and spiritual colonization that was sweeping across the region. The apostles' investigation revealed that the same company had obtained mining rights to sacred sites in 12 other villages, always using the same tactics, approaching desperate communities with promises of development, bribing local officials, and dismissing traditional spiritual concerns as primitive superstition. This is not just about trees and land, Selman told the gathered village council. This is about the systematic destruction of our spiritual identity, the severing of our connection to the ancestors and to the land that shaped us. It is a new form of colonization, not of bodies but of souls. The revelation sparked something in the village that had been dormant for too long, a sense of righteous anger, of spiritual warfare that went beyond individual deliverance to communal resistance. The 5 women who had been possessed became the core of a movement to protect sacred sites throughout the region. Ada's drumming, which had been silenced during her possession, returned with new power and purpose. Her rhythms now carried messages of resistance, calling other villages to stand firm against the spiritual raiders who sought to strip the land of its sacred significance. Funmi's weaving incorporated new patterns, symbols of protection and unity that were distributed to neighboring communities as signs of solidarity. Her cloth became banners of cultural identity, worn proudly by those who refused to surrender their heritage to the highest bidder. Nkem's voice, which had been used by spirits of rage and possession, now sang songs of healing and empowerment. Her compositions spread like wildfire across the region, becoming anthems of cultural resistance and spiritual awakening. The climax came when representatives of the mining company arrived in Ogbomoso, accompanied by government officials and a small contingent of police. They had come to begin operations on another site, a hill where the village's ancestors had been buried for centuries. But they found the community transformed. Instead of the compliant, desperate people they had encountered before, they faced a village united in spiritual purpose. The 5 formerly possessed women stood at the front of the crowd, their presence a living testimony to the power of spiritual resistance. "You cannot have this land," Ada announced, her voice carrying the authority of one who had wrestled with demons and emerged victorious. "This is sacred ground, blessed by the blood of our ancestors and consecrated by the tears of our children." The mining company's representative, a thin man with sweating palms and nervous eyes, stepped forward. "We have legal documents, signed contracts. This is business, not superstition. And we have spiritual authority," Apostle Selman replied, moving to stand with the women. "We have the backing of heaven and the blessing of our ancestors. Your documents are paper. Our covenant is written in the substance of creation itself." What followed was not a physical confrontation but a spiritual one. The apostle and the 5 women began to pray, not the quiet, personal prayers of individual devotion, but the kind of warfare intercession that shakes the foundations of spiritual wickedness in high places. Their prayers were joined by the voices of the entire village, creating a wall of sound that seemed to press against the mining company's representatives like a physical force. The very air around the sacred hill began to shimmer with spiritual energy, and those who had come to desecrate the land found themselves unable to approach. The mining company's retreat was swift and decisive. Their equipment, which had been unloaded from trucks just hours before, was hastily reloaded. Government officials, faced with the unified resistance of an entire community, found pressing business elsewhere. The police, most of whom were from similar villages and understood the spiritual dynamics at play, made no move to intervene. But the victory was not just about stopping one mining operation. It was about the rediscovery of spiritual identity, the reclamation of cultural authority, and the demonstration that faith and heritage could work together rather than in opposition. News of the victory spread to other villages, other communities facing similar threats. Delegations arrived from across the region, seeking to understand how Ajebandele had found the strength to resist. The 5 women became teachers, sharing their experience of spiritual warfare and cultural preservation. Apostle Selman found his ministry transformed as well. He was no longer just a preacher of individual salvation but a champion of communal liberation. His sermons began to address not just personal sin but systemic oppression, not just individual healing but cultural restoration. The gospel, he would say, is not just about getting souls to heaven, it's about bringing heaven's justice to earth. It's not just about personal relationships with God, it's about God's relationship with communities, with cultures, with the land itself. 5 years after the liberation of the possessed women, Ajebandele village had become a model for other communities facing similar challenges. The sacred grove that had been established on the hill had grown into a center of learning where traditional wisdom and Christian faith were taught side by side. Ada had become a master drummer, her rhythms now teaching young people about their cultural heritage while also leading worship in the village church. Her drums spoke of liberation, of the power of the ancestors to guide and protect, and of the God who honored the wisdom of the ages. Funmi's weaving cooperative had expanded to include women from 20 villages, their cloth telling the stories of resistance and renewal. The patterns she created had become symbols of cultural pride, worn by those who refused to be ashamed of their heritage. Nkem's voice had become the soundtrack of a movement. Her songs were sung at rallies and protests, at weddings and funerals, at plantings and harvests. Her music bridged the gap between the sacred and the political, the personal and the communal. Mama Ngozi had become a wise counselor, helping other communities navigate the complex waters of cultural preservation and spiritual authenticity. Her experience as one who had been possessed and liberated gave her unique authority to speak about the balance between honoring the ancestors and serving the living God. Comfort, the youngest of the 5, had gone on to seminary, where she was training to become a minister who could serve as a bridge between traditional and contemporary expressions of faith. Her thesis was on the decolonization of African Christianity, and it was already being discussed in theological circles across the continent. Apostle Selman stood on the hill overlooking Ajebandele village, watching the sun set over the land that had been preserved for future generations. The sacred grove rustled with the wind, and in that sound he could hear the voices of the ancestors, not in possession or torment but in blessing and guidance. The mining company had never returned, but their absence was not the end of the story. Other threats had emerged: developers wanting to build shopping centers on burial grounds, politicians promising progress in exchange for cultural compromise, religious movements that demanded the complete abandonment of traditional practices. But each challenge had been met with the same combination of spiritual warfare and cultural pride that had saved the village's sacred sites. The community had learned that their faith was not weakened by their heritage, it was strengthened by it. They had discovered that the God they served did not demand the erasure of their identity but its redemption. The 5 women who had once been vessels of spiritual possession had become vessels of spiritual empowerment. Their story had become a legend, told around fires and in churches, in schools and in sacred spaces. It was a story of how the collision between faith and culture could produce not destruction but transformation. As night fell over the village, the apostle offered a final prayer, not just for Agbamoso, but for all the communities across Africa where the battle for cultural and spiritual identity continued. He prayed for wisdom for the leaders, strength for the resistors, and healing for the land. And in the darkness, the spirits of the ancestors whispered their approval, while the Spirit of the Most High God moved across the water, just as he had in the beginning, bringing order from chaos, light from darkness, and hope from despair. The story of the possessed women of Ajebandele had become the story of a people's liberation, spiritual, cultural, and political. It was a testament to the power of roots that run deep, faith that stands firm, and the unbreakable connection between a people and the land that shaped them.